This is lecture 3 on Kant's philosophy of the self in the Critique of Pure Reason. Before I start the lecture, there are two mistakes I have to correct. In lecture 2, I said that my thesis has been on internet since April 5th, 1987. No, my thesis has been on internet since April 5th, 2017. I mean, internet didn't exist in the 1980s. I finished writing my thesis in 1987, but it went on internet just 2 years ago. Plus, I also said that Kant wrote his inaugural dissertation in 1777. No, it was written in 1770. I don't know why I say 1777. My apology. Now, today I was going to talk about the rest of chapter 2 and chapter 3, but I thought I should tell my personal history today because many of you don't know who I am and what I have done on how I studied the Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Now, I started studying Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1981. I was a 5 college student at Amherst, Massachusetts in the 80s, and in the spring of 1981, I took Professor Bill Koenig's course on the history of 17th and 18th century philosophy, which was said to be the most difficult course at Amherst College back then. And Professor Wolff started teaching from Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, then Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and then Kant. And he started teaching in February. And he started lecturing on Kant in March or April of at the end of March or at the beginning of April in 1981. We had only 3 weeks on Critique of Pure Reason. There's no way no one can really read through Critique of Pure Reason in 3 weeks. But that was 1781, which was the 200th anniversary of the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason. The Critique of Pure Reason was published in 1781, and I started studying the critique in 1981. So Professor Koenig said, "Hey, you guys studying Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in the 200th anniversary. This is something." Well, it was something for me, but as I said, it's impossible to read through and understand the whole Critique of Pure Reason in 3 weeks. I got very superficial knowledge of the Critique of Pure Reason by the end of the spring semester in 1981. And in the fall of the same year, the fall 1981, I took a course titled Idealism and Realism with Professor J. Garfield. Now, J. Garfield is now a professor of Smith College. Actually, he's the head of the philosophy department at Smith College now, and he's interested in Buddhism, and he spends lots of time in India and some time in Japan too. But back in the 1981, he was very interested in Kant because he was a PhD candidate. Back then, he had not finished his dissertation then. He was a student of Wilfred Sellars, and he started teaching before he finished his dissertation. And in the course called Idealism and Realism, we read Descartes, Kant, and also Hegel and Schopenhauer. You might go, Schopenhauer? Who the hell reads Schopenhauer? Well, I'll talk about that later on. And Since J. Garfield was a student of Wilfred Sellars, Sellars is called the analytic philosopher, but he is not as analytic as Strawson. I think Sellars' way of reading Kant is something between analytic and psychological. So Jay was a pretty moderate. I mean, he was neither left wing or right wing. He was neither analytic or psychological. So I was very impressed by the way he taught critique of pure reason, and also his classmate, who was also then a PhD candidate and who was also a student of Sellars, was his name was Bill DeVries, and DeVries was assistant or associate professor of philosophy at Amherst College, and he was an expert of Hegel. And after Jay spent about a month and a half on Kant, DeVries came to the class and talked about Hegel. So it was great that we read Critique of Pure Reason by Kant. Jay taught that. Then we also read some of the Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. We also read Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. I mean, these days, or even back then, very few people read Schopenhauer. I mean, Schopenhauer is so pessimistic. If you read it, you get depressed. And in most of the colleges in the United Kingdom and United States, Schopenhauer is not read. And one of the reasons why J. Garfield made us read Schopenhauer is that The World as Will and Representation is a very good book on for if you use it right to understand Kant's critique of pure reason. Because Kant talk about all Kant's philosophy is based on the appearance-reality distinction. What we know, representations, not things in themselves. So what we have is not knowledge of things in themselves, but the things of representations, i.e. appearances. And Schopenhauer titles book, the book title is The World as Will and Representation. And very few Kantians read Schopenhauer, but it's really good to read The World as Will and Representation. Well, it's also good Heidegger's Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, but those two books by Schopenhauer and Heidegger are not usually read in the United States or in the United Kingdom. But well, I mean, analytic approach to the Kant's critique of pure reason has been the mainstream of Kant studies in the United States as well as in the United Kingdom. And then after I got my bachelor's degree, I was just going to leave Amherst, but then I graduated from college in the spring 1983, but before, like a few weeks before my graduation, just a friend of mine told me that Robert Paul Wolff is teaching Kant's Critique of Pure Reason at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in next semester. Bob Wolff had not taught Critique of Pure Reason for a long time. I think he had not taught the Critique of Pure Reason for at least 7 or 8 years. The reason I'm not quite sure about, he published the book called The Autonomy of Reason, which is on Kant's theory of morals. I mean, in 1963, he published a book, Kant's Theory of Mental Activity, which I talked about many times in this series of lectures. And 10 years later, in 1973, he published The Autonomy of Reason. But by that time, Kant's studies was not really popular at American schools. Plus, maybe he felt like he really completed the study of Kant's philosophy. And so 1973 or 74, maybe 75, he stopped teaching Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and Bob Wolff just started teaching the philosophy of economics and Freud and philosophy of psychology and other things. But a friend of mine told me, hey, if you're interested in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, you really should stay at Amherst, because Robert Paul Wolff is the best professor to study Kant with, and he's teaching the Critique of Pure Reason at the graduate level next year. So you really should stay here. So I did. So I took his seminar on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in the spring of 1984 as a master's candidate, and it was very good. And I think one of the reasons why Robert Paul Wolff started or restarted teaching the Critique of Pure Reason in 1984 is that the year before, 1983, the year I graduated from college, and in 1983, Henry Allison published a book, Transcendental Idealism. It was published by Yale. It became very popular, and as a subtitle of the Henry Allison's book, Transcendental Idealism, was its defense and interpretation. Henry Allison defended transcendental idealism. Now, for many years, transcendental idealism was treated as a junk, well, not a junk, but as P.F. Strawson said, transcendental idealism is nothing but academic fantasy, and he rejected it, and Strawson's analytic approach to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason became very popular in the United States as well as in the United Kingdom. And I think Professor Robert Paul Wolff got pretty upset, because his reading of Kant is the mirror opposite of the way Strawson did. So that's one reason why Robert Paul stopped teaching Critique of Pure Reason, although he's one of the best men to teach that. But he published Kant's Theory of Mental Activity in 1963, and then The Bounds of Sense came out in 1966, and it became very popular, and The Bounds of Sense was read in many American and British schools. So I think Bob Wolff kind of gave up the hope to persuade transcendental idealism is the core of the Critique of Pure Reason. But Henry Allison wrote a very good book, Transcendental Idealism, and Allison's English is very easy to read. I mean, Allison's writing is very readable, whereas Professor Wolff's writing is very difficult to read. And since people started thinking that transcendental idealism is very core of the Critique of Pure Reason, maybe Bob Wolff thought he should start teaching Kant's Critique of Pure Reason again, because Bob Wolff is the one who really defended transcendental idealism 20 years before Henry Allison did. And but his book Kant's Theory of Mental Activity, published by Harvard in 1963, was maybe popular for a few years, but after 1966, Strawson's Bounds of Sense really took over, and the people just rejected transcendental idealism. I think that's the story. Now, I've really nothing against P.F. Strawson personally. I think he was a very nice guy. I mean, I never met him, but as Robert Paul Wolff was his student back in 1954. I mean, Strawson was a very polite and gentle British man at Oxford, I think. But it's not. I mean, some people get the impression that I dislike Strawson. No, it's not so. I mean, I have nothing against him. It's not that I dislike Strawson. I just disagree with bounds of sense. That's it. And what I think is that in Kant, there's a section in the Critique of Pure Reason where he talks about the refutation of idealism. Kant refutes Descartes' dogmatic idealism, and Berkeley's, excuse me, Kant rejected Descartes' problematic idealism and Berkeley's dogmatic idealism. But Strawson rejected Kant's transcendental idealism. So the bounds of sense is pretty much a refutation of transcendental idealism. Just as refutation of idealism by Kant is a refutation of Descartes' problematic idealism and Berkeley's dogmatic idealism. But I think transcendental idealism or transcendental psychology of transcendental idealism is the most important thing in the Critique of Pure Reason. Now, in my last lecture, I talked about phenomena in general. And some people really didn't like the idea of phenomena in general. What the hell is phenomena in general? Kant said object in general or something in general. You know, transcendental object X. But even though Kant said something in general, he never said phenomena in general. Why did you make up that word? Well, as I said, for Descartes, mind is better known than the bodies. I just said mind is better known than the bodies. To know the mind, of course, you cannot know the mind itself. You cannot know who you are in yourself, what you are in yourself. You just know how you appear to yourself. Only you can know the phenomenal self, or you can know yourself phenomenally, not nominally. And to know even yourself, you have to know things in space. All right? If you want to know yourself as a phenomenon, you have to know all the phenomena in space. To know, even just to know oneself, you have to know every other phenomenon to know your phenomenal self. So without knowing all the phenomena in space, you cannot even know yourself phenomenally. So you need to have a knowledge of phenomena in general to know yourself phenomenally. That's the point. But since I use that word, some people are disturbed. But let me tell you, again, this is not maybe a criticism of Strawson. What Strawson did in the bounds of sense is, as I said in lecture 1, descriptive metaphysics. Now, he didn't use the term descriptive metaphysics in the bounds of sense, but he used the term in the Individuals, which was published a few years before, some years before the bounds of sense. What the hell is descriptive metaphysics? I mean, Strawson created the term descriptive metaphysics. And if he can say descriptive metaphysics, I should be able to say phenomena in general. Okay? Because for Descartes, the only existence for sure is his own existence. I might be wrong, I might be stupid, I might be an idiot, I might be deceived, but as long as I'm being deceived, as long as I'm wrong, I have to exist. I can't even be wrong if I don't exist. So for sure, the only thing I know for sure is that I exist. No matter what, in what way I exist, how I exist, it doesn't matter. I exist. I can't even be wrong. I can't even be an idiot unless I exist. Oh, I might be a genius, but whether I'm a genius or idiot or stupid, I mean, my existence has to be, I have to exist. Then, from the existence of myself, from the existence of the mind, I infer the existence of things in space, extended things around here. But for Kant, no. You can know your mind only as well as you know the bodies in space. Phenomena to know yourself, to know your phenomenal self, to know yourself inwardly, you have to know things outside in space outwardly. Phenomena in general must be presupposed to know phenomenal self. That's why I use the word phenomenal self, which some people didn't like. As I said, Kant says object in general, something in general, object X, transcendental object. He never says phenomena in general, but I just create the term phenomena in general to explain my view of Kant well. Now, Kant rejected metaphysics. Kant rejected transcendent metaphysics, but Strawson thought descriptive metaphysics is possible. So I'm not an expert on something in general or object X, but I think I explained well my viewpoint by using the term phenomena in general. By the way, the term Bob Wolff talked about the transcendental object. Well, I mean, this book, which was published by Notre Dame in 1968, the year Bobby Kennedy got shot, and this was edited by Paul Wolff. I mean, some of you might have this because in 1963, Wolff published Kant's theory of mental activity, but I think it went out of print after a few years. I mean, I think Kant's theory of mental activity was out of print for some years until Peter Smith published it. Peter Smith is a company. I don't know how they're doing it now, but Peter Smith used to publish the good books which went out of print. But for a few years, Kant's theory of mental activity was out of print, and the most important part of the Kant's theory of mental activity was the section on subjective deduction. And Bob Wolff, this is a collection of the critical essays on Kant, edited by Robert Paul Wolff. Maybe if you are older than 50, maybe you have this. And in this book, I just show you. Well, it's got essays by Louis White Beck, Charles Parsons, and Walsh, and Samuel Todes, and there are very good essays here. And Bob Wolff wrote a reconstruction of the argument of the subjective deduction. This is a part of the Kant's theory of mental activity. And on page 100, there's a figure here. This is about transcendental object or object X or object in general or something in general. This is the figure Wolff used. This is the page 100 of Kant. And in that chapter, Wolff explains very well about the transcendental object or object in general. So you should read that if you want to understand that, because I talked about the phenomena in general and not object in general or something in general. This is again, I don't know what page on Kant's theory of mental activity this is, but in this book, that's page 100. Now, I'm not an expert on transcendental object, so I'm not going to explain much about that. But one thing that Kant draws a distinction between transcendent and transcendental. Something transcendent is transcendent means something which goes beyond the limits of experience. So that I say like a God is transcendent, Leibniz models are transcendent. They go beyond the limits of experience. But something transcendental is what makes experience possible. So transcendent is something above or beyond the experience, but something transcendental is what makes experience possible. Now, when I say experience, this is empirical knowledge when I say experience here. But even if Kant draws a distinction between transcendent and transcendental, he doesn't always stick to it. When he said transcendent, he really means transcendent. But when he says transcendental, he sometimes means transcendental. He sometimes means transcendent, but he also sometimes means transcendental. So he doesn't, although he makes a distinction between transcendent or transcendental, he doesn't always stick to it. But when he said transcendental object, that is transcendental object, not transcendent object. In other words, the term transcendent is a metaphysical term, and the word transcendental is an epistemological term. That's what you have to know. Oh, also I have to know I have to explain the distinction between understanding and reason. Now, what's the difference between understanding and reason? Well, there is a distinction, but in the critique of pure reason, there's really no essential difference between reason and understanding. Well, it's different in the critique of practical reason, but as far as the critique of pure reason goes, there's no essential difference between understanding and reason. Now, there are two sources of knowledge. One is sensibility, the other is understanding or intelligence. Now, in the dissertation of 1770, not 1777 as I said in lecture 2, in the dissertation of 1770, Kant said, intelligence knows things in themselves, or intelligence knows intelligible world, and sensibility knows appearances, representation. Sensibility knows a sensible world. So with the sensibility, we know sensible world, i.e. phenomenal world. With intelligence, we know intelligible world, noumenal world. But after 11 years, he changed that view and came to the conclusion that when sensibility and intelligence are employed in conjunction, we know things as they appear. When sensibility and intelligence are employed in conjunction, we know the sensible world. And we cannot know the intelligible world at all. Like, we cannot know God. Now, sensibility and intelligence are two different sources, two sources of knowledge. Knowledge of sensible world, knowledge of appearances, knowledge of representations. But, so there's a essential difference between sensibility and intelligence or understanding. But what I said, there's really no essential difference between understanding and reason, is that when the intelligence is applied to appearances, representations, it's called understanding. When that same intelligence is applied to things in themselves, it's called reason. I mean, understanding and reason have pretty much the same faculty. I mean, sensibility has a different faculty. But understanding and the reason, they pretty much have the same faculty, at least in the critique of pure reason. As I said, it's different in the second critique. And when the intelligence applied to appearance, it's called understanding. When the intelligence applied to things in themselves, it's called reason. That's understood. Well, some people really get confused between the two. Even someone like Emerson, who is a great New England intellectual, didn't really quite understand the difference between understanding and reason. Then that's the difference between reason and understanding. And pure concepts of understanding are the categories, and pure concepts of reason are the ideas. Well, we'll talk about that, or I'll talk about them later on. Those are the things that you have to know when you study Kant's critique of pure reason. Now, I think I'm talking pretty long today. I mean, I didn't even go to chapter 2. I mean, I was going to talk about the second half of chapter 2 and chapter 3, but I talked about many other things. So what should I talk? Okay. All right. Maybe excuse me. Maybe I should talk about the rest of chapter 2 in my next lecture. Well, usually when you study Kant's critique of pure reason, you start reading Kant's transcendental aesthetic. Now, aesthetic has nothing to do with beauty. When you say aesthetic or aesthetics, it's a study of beauty. I mean, if you take a philosophy course entitled Aesthetics, I mean, professor talk about what is beautiful. But in Kant, for Kant, aesthetic has nothing to do with the study of beauty. It has something to do with sensibility. And since space and time are pure forms of he talks about space and time in the transcendental aesthetic. In my thesis, I went right into the transcendental deduction of categories, because as the title of my book is Kant's philosophy of the self, and not Kant's philosophy of the space and time, I really didn't write much about space and time. Now, I'm not an expert on the philosophy of space and time. I'm not an expert on Einstein. I'm not an expert on theory of relativity, and I'm not a philosopher of mathematics. But I thought I should say some things about philosophy of space and time. Now, Kant said that space and time are pure forms of intuition. Pure forms of what intuition? Pure forms of sensible intuition. Because only human being has, the only intuition human being has a sensible intuition. And space and time must be presupposed for people, for human beings to intuit sensibly. So, I mean, since Aristotle, everything is composed of form and matter. Same with Kant. Aristotle talked about being, but Kant talks about, as other 17th and 18th century philosophers do, about knowledge, epistemology. And form and matter, both form and matter is required for any knowledge. So that if a manifold is a matter, space and time are forms. So space and time are pure forms of intuition, pure forms of sensible intuition. That's not hard to understand, but sometimes Kant says pure intuition. When Kant says pure intuition, he often means pure forms of intuition. It's a pure intuition, just an abbreviation, pure forms of sensible intuition. But sometimes Kant really means pure intuition, which is different from pure form of intuition. That's B161 in the Critique of Pure Reason. Now, he says, but space and time are represented a priori, not merely as forms of sensible intuition, but also as intuitions themselves. That's very hard to understand. I mean, pure forms of sensible intuition, it's easy to understand. But space and time, not just pure forms of sensible intuition, but pure intuitions themselves. That's very hard to understand. Okay, I've talked a bit too long today, so I'll talk about the philosophy of space and time. And as I said, I'm not an expert on philosophy of space and time as Jacob Hintiker or Charles Parsons, so I may not be explained very well about the pure intuition, pure forms of intuition, intellectual intuition, but I will talk about the intuition in the transcendental aesthetic in the next lecture.